In a world where bias often blinds people from seeing the truth, a shocking encounter forces a police officer to confront his own deep-seated prejudices. A routine traffic stop spirals out of control when a cop, driven by racist assumptions, violently attacks a man without realizing who he really is. Little does he know, the man he punches is no ordinary citizen. He's his superior, a powerful figure with the authority to change everything. This is a story of justice, irony, and a much-needed wake-up call. Let's dive into the tale of the racist cop who punched his own boss. Officer Mike Thompson had spent over a decade on the force, patrolling the same neighborhoods day in and day out. To him, this part of town was nothing more than a trouble spot, a place he viewed through a lens of suspicion. He'd seen enough incidents here to build up a wall of assumptions, judgments he'd come to rely on without thinking twice. As he cruised down a narrow street lined with old brick buildings and dimly lit storefronts, he spotted an unfamiliar black SUV parked at the corner. The vehicle looked out of place, a bit too new, too clean for this part of town. It was a slow night, and he was itching for some action. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights, signaling for the driver to pull over. The SUV rolled to a stop, and Mike took a deep breath, already constructing a scenario in his mind. Drug dealer, maybe. Someone on parole or just another troublemaker trying to dodge the law, he thought as he adjusted his cap. He approached the car with his hand resting on his holster, a posture he'd perfected over years of patrolling these streets. It wasn't just a habit, it was a display of power, a signal that he was in control. Inside the SUV, the driver rolled down the window. The man was black, dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans. He looked calm, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight. He didn't look like he was in a hurry or nervous, but Mike didn't notice these details. He was too busy cataloging everything through his biased filters: the hoodie, the neighborhood, the fact that it was late at night. "License and registration," Mike barked out, his tone clipped and demanding. The man inside the car didn't move immediately. Instead, he looked up at Mike with a raised eyebrow, as if he were puzzled by the intensity of the request. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice steady and polite. It wasn't the kind of response Mike was expecting. Usually, people fumbled for their documents or tried to explain themselves, but this man seemed unbothered. Mike's suspicion deepened. He felt a flicker of irritation. The man's calm demeanor felt almost like a challenge, as if he were daring Mike to make the next move. "Step out of the vehicle," Mike snapped, his voice laced with impatience. The command wasn't necessary, but Mike wanted to assert his authority, to remind this man who was in charge. "Why?" the driver asked, still seated, his eyes now locked onto Mike's with a look that was hard to read. Was it defiance? Amusement? Whatever it was, it only served to fan the flames of Mike's frustration. Mike's pulse quickened. He was used to people complying, especially in this part of town. He leaned in closer, the edge of his body language tipping from professional to aggressive. "I said, step out of the vehicle," he repeated, emphasizing each word. The man sighed, as if he were dealing with a minor inconvenience, and slowly pushed open the car door. He stepped out with a fluid, confident motion, standing tall. He was well built, with a presence that was hard to ignore. Despite his casual clothes, there was something about him that seemed authoritative, though Mike refused to acknowledge it. "You mind telling me what this is about?" the man asked calmly, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. There was no fear in his voice, no sign of intimidation. Mike found this unsettling. He was used to seeing a mix of fear and deference in situations like this, but this man seemed different. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Mike ordered, his voice a shade louder now. He glanced around quickly. A small crowd had started to gather, curious faces peering from doorways and across the street. Mike felt a surge of annoyance. It was bad enough this guy wasn't cooperating. Now he had an audience too. The man raised his hand slightly, not as a gesture of surrender, but more like a motion of appeasement. "Okay, officer, I'm not resisting. I just want to know what this is about," he said, his tone still calm, almost gentle. But Mike wasn't in the mood for a conversation. He took a step closer, invading the man's space. "You look like you don't belong here," he spat out, the words leaving his mouth before he could even think them through. It was a raw, unfiltered expression of his biases, something he wouldn't normally say out loud but felt justified in this moment. The man's expression changed slightly, a flicker of something like disappointment passing over his face. "You don't know anything about me," the man replied, his voice dropping to a quiet, almost somber tone. Mike felt a surge of anger, as if the man's response was a personal affront. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," he demanded, grabbing the man's arm with unnecessary force. And that's when it happened. In a split second, Mike's anger boiled over. Without warning, he swung his fist, landing a hard punch right on the man's jaw. The force of the blow knocked the man off balance, and he stumbled back against his own car, catching himself with one hand. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The onlookers gasped, several of them raising their phones, capturing the incident from every angle. The man straightened up slowly, wiping a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked at Mike with an expression that wasn't shock, but something deeper. It was a look of profound disappointment, almost like a father scolding a child who had let him down. Mike, breathing heavily, felt a surge of adrenaline. He expected the man to react, to fight back, to give him a reason to escalate the situation further. But the man just stood there, looking at him as if he were waiting for something. "You done?" the man asked quietly, his voice so calm it almost sounded like pity. The aftermath of the punch felt like a crack in the fabric of reality. For a split second, everything went silent. The usual sounds of the city, the hum of distant traffic, the chatter of passers-by, the whir of a street vendor's cart, all seemed to vanish. It was as if the entire block held its breath, shocked by what had just happened. Mike stood there, fist still clenched, his knuckles throbbing from the impact. He felt a strange sense of triumph mixed with a rush of fear. It was a sensation he wasn't entirely unfamiliar with, the raw, electric high of power mixed with the immediate anxiety that comes after crossing an unspoken line. He looked around, eyes darting from the man he'd just punched to the small crowd that had gathered. The faces staring back at him were a mix of shock, horror, and something else, something like silent accusation. The man wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing a line of blood across his cheek. He wasn't cowering, wasn't yelling or fighting back. Instead, he looked up at Mike with an expression that was calm, almost serene. It was the look of someone who knew something important, something the other person didn't. It was a look that sent a chill down Mike's spine. "You really have no idea who I am, do you?" the man asked, his voice level and composed, despite the fresh bruise darkening on his jaw. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather instead of recovering from a sucker punch. Mike's heartbeat roared in his ears. He couldn't quite process the question. His mind was still racing, trying to figure out what had just happened and why it didn't feel like a victory. "I don't need to know who you are," Mike spat out, his voice harsher than intended. "I know your type." The man gave a small, rueful smile, as if Mike had confirmed something he already knew. "You really think you know my type, huh?" he said softly, almost to himself. He turned slightly, glancing over at the crowd. The bystanders were no longer just observers. They had become participants, holding up their phones, recording the entire scene from different angles. A few were whispering to each other, eyes wide with disbelief. In that moment, a voice crackled to life on Mike's radio, slicing through the tension like a knife. "All units, be advised." The dispatcher's voice was calm, but carried an edge of urgency. "Chief Anderson is conducting plainclothes field observations today. I repeat, Chief Anderson is out in the field in plain clothes. Do not interfere." The words hit Mike like a freight train. The color drained from his face as he processed what he'd just heard. His eyes snapped back to the man standing in front of him, who was now watching him with an almost amused expression, as if waiting for the penny to drop. The realization was like a punch to Mike's own gut. This wasn't just some random guy he'd pulled over. This was Chief Anderson, his boss, the head of the entire department. Mike's mouth went dry. His lips parted, but no words came out. He felt like he'd been plunged underwater, his brain struggling to keep up with the sudden shift in reality. This was the man who had hired him, who had signed off on his promotions, who had given speeches about justice and accountability at every department meeting. This was the man who had just taken his punch without retaliating, without even flinching. I didn't realize," Mike stammered, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. He felt the adrenaline drain out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. This wasn't a simple mistake. This was a career-ending disaster. He had just assaulted his own boss in front of a dozen witnesses, all with their phones out, recording every second. Chief Anderson let out a slow, deep breath, almost like a sigh. He wiped his hand across his mouth again, looking at the blood on his fingers with a detached sort of interest, as if it belonged to someone else. He didn't seem angry. If anything, he looked sad, disappointed. It was the kind of disappointment that cuts deeper than any reprimand. "You assumed," Anderson said quietly, shaking his head. "You assumed you knew everything you needed to know about me the second you saw me." He gestured to his clothes, the plain hoodie, the jeans, the casual shoes. "Didn't even bother to ask for my ID." Mike opened his mouth, trying to say something, anything that could salvage the situation, but his brain felt like it was stuck in molasses. I thought," he started, but the words felt hollow and useless. "You thought I was a threat," Anderson finished for him. His voice wasn't angry, just calm and resigned. He glanced around at the crowd, then back at Mike. "And now you've made yourself the threat. This could have gone very differently, Officer Thompson." The use of his name felt like a slap to Mike's face, a reminder of just how badly he'd screwed up. He could feel the eyes of the crowd burning into him, could almost taste the judgment in the air. He'd gone from the one in control to the one under scrutiny in the blink of an eye. "I didn't know it was you," Mike blurted out, his voice cracking. It was a pathetic defense, and he knew it even as he said it. He sounded like a child caught doing something wrong, scrambling for any excuse. Anderson tilted his head slightly, regarding him with a look that was almost pitying. "And that's supposed to make it better?" he asked quietly. He stepped closer, so close that Mike could see the tiny flecks of blood on his collar, could feel the quiet intensity of the man's presence. "What if it wasn't me? What if it was just another black man? Would you still feel justified?" Mike felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He wanted to say something, to explain himself, to offer some kind of excuse, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would make this right. The truth was laid bare, exposed under the harsh light of irony and truth. He had acted on his biases, plain and simple. Chief Anderson took a step back, his eyes sweeping over the crowd one last time before returning to Mike. "This isn't over," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made it clear he wasn't just talking about this incident. He was talking about everything. The systemic issues, the prejudice, the broken trust. He turned on his heel and started walking away, leaving Mike standing there, frozen in place. The crowd parted for him, a mixture of respect and shock in their faces. As Anderson disappeared into the shadows, Mike was left alone in the spotlight, exposed for everyone to see. He could feel the weight of the cameras on him, the unblinking eyes of the phones that had captured every second of his downfall. The world around him seemed to tilt and shift, and for the first time in his life, he realized what it felt like to be truly powerless. Mike's world began to unravel in the days following the incident. The viral video spread like wildfire, pinging across social media platforms, evening news segments, and online forums. It was everywhere, replayed in slow motion. The punch, the gasp from the crowd, and Chief Anderson's calm, dignified reaction. The footage cut deeper each time it was shown, a stark display of prejudice and power gone unchecked. In the hours after the altercation, Mike had been escorted back to the precinct in silence. His fellow officers had given him a wide berth, avoiding eye contact, their faces a mix of shock and barely concealed judgment. He was no longer the confident, seasoned officer they had known. Now, he was the man who had punched the chief, the face of an incident that was quickly becoming a symbol of everything wrong with the force. Sitting in the dimly lit break room, Mike watched the news segment on a small TV mounted in the corner. He stared at his own image on the screen, fists clenched, face twisted with anger. It felt surreal, like watching a stranger make a monumental mistake. The reporter's voice was flat and serious as she narrated the scene. A disturbing case of police misconduct caught on camera. An officer's violent actions towards an unarmed black man, who was later revealed to be his own superior, Chief Anderson, have sparked outrage and calls for accountability. Mike looked away, unable to bear the sight of it any longer. He pressed his hands against his eyes, trying to block out the world. He could still hear the voices, though, muffled conversations in the hallway, whispered words that weren't meant for his ears but found their way to him anyway. "They're saying it's all over the country now. Even the big networks picked it up," one officer murmured. "It's a PR nightmare," another responded. "The chief's handling it well, but Thompson's done. There's no coming back from this." Mike felt a shiver run down his spine. He had been in this precinct for over a decade, a place that had once felt like a second home. Now, it felt like a hostile territory. He could sense the judgment in every glance, the silent accusations that filled the air like static. A few hours later, Mike was summoned to a meeting with Chief Anderson. The walk to the chief's office felt like a funeral march, every step heavy with dread. The hallway seemed longer than ever before, stretching out like a tunnel leading to some inevitable, crushing fate. When he finally reached the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but his pulse was erratic, pounding in his ears like a drum. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Chief Anderson was seated behind his desk, dressed in his full uniform. He looked every bit the part of a commanding officer, poised, serious, and unflinching. The bruise from the punch had darkened, a stark reminder of Mike's impulsive violence. The chief's eyes flicked up, meeting Mike's with an intensity that felt like it could burn through stone. "Sit down, Officer Thompson," Anderson said calmly, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Mike obeyed, his legs feeling like they might give out beneath him. He sank into the chair, unable to meet the chief's gaze for more than a fleeting second. He stared down at his hands instead, noticing how they still trembled slightly, a physical manifestation of the storm raging inside him. "I want you to know," Chief Anderson began, his voice even and measured, "that I've watched the video several times. I've heard every excuse you might be thinking of, and I've spoken to several witnesses." He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "But I want to hear it from you. Why did you do it?" Mike swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, like he'd swallowed a handful of sand. He struggled to find the words, but every excuse he had prepared felt hollow now, stripped of meaning under the chief's steady gaze. I thought you were a threat," he said finally, his voice cracking. Anderson raised an eyebrow. "A threat?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't take a moment to assess the situation. You just acted on your first instinct. And that instinct was rooted in what?" Mike flinched as if he'd been struck again. He knew where this was going. He knew what the chief was getting at, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. "Bias," Anderson said, filling the silence for him. "You acted on a bias you probably don't even realize you have, but it's there, Officer Thompson. It's been there all along, shaping how you see people, how you treat them." He leaned back, sighing heavily, as if the weight of the entire department rested on his shoulders. And this time, it didn't just harm a civilian. It harmed your own superior. It harmed this department. It harmed the trust the community had left in us. Mike's vision blurred with the sting of unshed tears. He blinked rapidly, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but the words felt like dust, meaningless and empty. "Sorry isn't enough," the chief snapped, his voice rising for the first time. He stood up abruptly, pacing behind his desk, his hands clenched into fists. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The community is outside our doors right now protesting, demanding accountability, demanding justice, They want answers, and what am I supposed to tell them? That one of my own officers couldn't even recognize his boss because his prejudice blinded him? Mike slumped further in his chair, feeling like a child being scolded. He wanted to disappear, to fade into the background and never be seen again. The gravity of what he'd done was sinking in deeper with every word the chief said, pulling him down like quicksand. Anderson stopped pacing, turning to face Mike once more. He took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly, though his eyes still held a steely resolve. "You've been suspended, effective immediately," he said quietly. "And I'm launching a full internal investigation. There will be disciplinary action, and it won't be light." Mike nodded numbly. He had expected this, but hearing the words out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. His career, the life he'd built, was crumbling around him, and it was his own fault. He couldn't blame anyone else. The chief's voice softened even further, taking on a tone that was almost compassionate, though it was tinged with disappointment. "You have a choice to make, Mike," he said. "You can walk away from this and let it define you, let it be the end of your career, or you can face it, own up to your actions, and start working to change. Not just yourself, but the system you've been a part of for so long." Mike looked up, meeting Anderson's gaze for the first time since the meeting had started. There was a flicker of something in the chief's eyes, a tiny spark of hope, of potential redemption. It was the smallest of lifelines, but it was there. "I'll try," Mike managed to say, his voice small and broken. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. Chief Anderson nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. "Trying is the first step," he said, "but it won't be easy. It's a long road ahead, and it starts with facing the consequences of what you've done." He turned away, signaling that the meeting was over. Mike stood up on shaky legs, his body feeling heavy like he was carrying the weight of all his mistakes with him. He walked to the door, pausing just before he opened it. "I'll do better," he said, barely above a whisper. Anderson didn't look back, but he nodded once. "We'll see," he replied. The weeks that followed were some of the longest of Mike's life. His suspension meant he couldn't set foot in the precinct, and he was left with an uncomfortable void, hours of empty time that seemed to stretch endlessly. He spent most days at home, avoiding the news and the internet, trying to escape the constant flood of coverage about the incident. But avoiding it didn't make it go away. The video was still everywhere, circulating on every platform, dissected by commentators and discussed in communities nationwide. His name was on everyone's lips, and he had become a symbol, but not the kind he'd ever aspired to be. The protests outside the precinct had grown larger over the days, a mix of angry community members, activists, and supporters of police reform. They held signs with phrases like "Justice for All" and "End Racial Bias." Some signs even had his name scrawled across them, urging him to take responsibility. He tried to avoid driving past the precinct, but even when he managed to stay away, his phone buzzed constantly with messages from old friends, former colleagues, and even family members who'd seen his name in the news. Mike spent long hours sitting on his living room couch trying to understand how he'd ended up here. He replayed the incident in his mind, examining each moment, each decision, and each assumption he'd made about Chief Anderson that night. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth about himself. He had allowed prejudice to cloud his judgment. He'd always thought of himself as a fair cop, someone who treated everyone equally, but the video proved otherwise. And he couldn't escape the fact that it was his actions, his choices, his fists, that had led him to this breaking point. A few days into his suspension, he received a letter from the precinct. It was a mandatory summons to attend bias training sessions, a program newly initiated by Chief Anderson in response to the incident. Mike knew that these sessions would be grueling, uncomfortable, and emotionally challenging, but he also understood that he had no choice. If he wanted any chance of keeping his career, he'd have to face this head-on. The training sessions were held in a modest conference room at the precinct, with a group of about 15 officers who'd also been selected for the program. Some were there voluntarily, Others, like Mike, had been strongly encouraged to attend. The facilitator was a seasoned social worker with years of experience in conflict resolution and racial bias education. She didn't pull any punches, starting the session by laying out the brutal truth of systemic racism and the role law enforcement had played in perpetuating it. She used real examples, painful statistics, and hard questions that left the room in heavy silence. When it was Mike's turn to share his story, he felt a lump in his throat. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, a mix of judgment, curiosity, and maybe even pity. He started slowly, describing the incident in halting sentences, trying to avoid sounding defensive or excusing his actions. As he spoke, he found himself admitting things he'd never said out loud, acknowledging biases he'd kept buried and actions he'd justified in the name of authority. Saying it out loud, in front of his peers, was humbling and raw. The facilitator asked him a simple but piercing question. "What was going through your mind the moment you saw the chief in that car?" Mike's voice cracked as he answered. "I thought he was someone up to no good. Someone who didn't belong. I assumed things about him based on his clothes, his car, and his race." The words felt like acid on his tongue, burning with each syllable. But as he spoke them, he felt a strange, tentative release, as if admitting his mistake out loud was the first step toward some kind of redemption. As the sessions continued over the following weeks, Mike's understanding of himself and his role as a police officer began to shift. He started to see how his biases had shaped his interactions, how they had subtly influenced his behavior without him even realizing it. The training forced him to confront painful truths about his past actions, moments he'd previously dismissed or justified. He began to understand the responsibility he had, not just as an officer, but as a human being, to approach every person with respect, to see beyond assumptions and stereotypes. Chief Anderson was present for the final session, sitting quietly in the back, watching as Mike and the other officers shared their reflections. When it was Mike's turn to speak, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the chief's gaze on him. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his fellow officers, some of whom had supported him, others who'd quietly condemned him, and spoke from the heart. "I was wrong," he began, his voice steady. "I was wrong to act the way I did, wrong to let my own assumptions dictate my actions. I've spent years thinking I was immune to this, to bias, to prejudice. But I'm not. No one is. I thought I was a good cop because I followed the rules, because I kept my record clean. But now I see that being a good cop is about more than that. It's about accountability, humility, and seeing every person as they truly are, not as I assume them to be." There was a heavy silence in the room when he finished, a silence that held the weight of understanding, pain, and perhaps even forgiveness. Chief Anderson nodded once, an almost imperceptible gesture, but Mike saw it, and it felt like a small step toward reconciliation. When he returned home that night, Mike knew that his journey wasn't over. The training sessions had been an eye-opener, a beginning, but there was still much to learn and much to prove. He wasn't sure if he would ever be able to fully regain the trust of his community or his fellow officers, but he knew he was ready to try. Over the next few months, Mike began volunteering in community outreach programs, working alongside local leaders to rebuild the trust he'd broken. He met with youth groups, sat down with community organizers, and spent time listening to people he had once viewed with suspicion. These experiences humbled him, showing him a side of the community he had ignored for years. Chief Anderson continued to monitor his progress, occasionally calling him in for one-on-one meetings. Their conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always grounded in the shared goal of moving forward. Anderson challenged him, holding him accountable for every action, every word. He was fair but firm, a constant reminder that redemption was a privilege, not a guarantee. Months later, at a public forum organized by the department, Mike was invited to speak. The room was packed, filled with members of the community, his fellow officers, and even some of the protesters who had once called for his resignation. He felt the familiar weight of judgment as he stepped up to the podium, the memory of his mistakes heavy in the air. "I'm here because I made a terrible mistake," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here because I failed to live up to the values I thought I held. But I'm also here because I believe in change, and I believe that facing our mistakes is the only way to truly move forward." He spoke honestly, detailing his journey, his biases, and his commitment to growth. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but rather offered a promise to continue learning, to hold himself accountable, and to work toward a future where moments like his never happened again. When he finished, there was a brief silence, and then a quiet murmur of applause filled the room. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As Mike stepped down from the podium, he caught sight of Chief Anderson in the back, nodding quietly, a small sign of respect between two men who had once been adversaries but were now allies in the fight for a better, more just future. Mike knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and doubts, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, a determination to rebuild the trust he had broken and to become the officer he had once believed himself to be. Not through words, but through actions, one step at a time.